On Tuesday the 25th of November 1890, the London Evening News published an article under the headline, "The Living Victims of Jack the Ripper," which gave details of how the murders had impacted on the lives of those who, for one reason or another, had found themselves accused of being the perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders. The article read, "No fewer than between 140 and 150 different persons have been in the hands of the police on suspicion either of being the actual murderer or of having something to do with the savage deeds. These include truly all sorts and conditions of men, from the dweller in the mansion to the dosser in the fourpenny lodging house. In the majority of the cases, the parties were kept in custody only for sufficient time to question them and to obtain some confirmation of the statements they made to their movements on the dates of the murders. About 100 of the suspects were made up of butchers, skin dressers, artisans, labourers, sailors, lodging and public house loungers, and men of vicious characters known to the police. Some 30 or 40 of these individuals were Jews. The remainder of the arrested persons comprised gentlemen of independent means, doctors, medical students, journalists, commercial travellers, and missionaries. Not one of these victims was locked up longer than 24 hours, but some of them, though they were released, did not sufficiently establish their innocence to prevent their being shadowed for some time afterwards. Not only did many respectable working men suffer the shame and ignominy of being marched to the police station, followed by a howling mob for whose rude insults and wild threats they formed a target, but lost a day's work, which they could ill afford, while others, by being detained, were done out of jobs which would have afforded them employment for weeks. They were, I should explain, arrested on their way to work in the early morning. I heard, by the way, only the other day, that the wife of one of these men, a respectable artisan, on being informed that her husband had been run in as Jack the Ripper, received such a shock to the nervous system that she never recovered, dying from the effects about 3 months afterwards. One of the chief circumstances which led to the arrest of many of the men was that they resembled the description given of persons who had been seen in the vicinity of the scenes of the murder not long after the discovery of the bodies. In some instances, the most trifling incidents caused the arrest, but in a few cases, especially those of 2 medical men and a journalist, the authorities regarded the circumstantial evidence as so strong against the parties that they were not only retained in custody for a considerable number of hours, but were also closely watched by detectives for weeks afterwards. The newspaper man referred to has been run in no fewer than 3 times, twice after the Miller's Court tragedy, and again a week following the Castle Alley mutilation. On each occasion, he was exploring Murderland by night for professional purposes. The gravest points paraded against him were that he had been seen alone visiting the scenes of the murders during the small hours in the morning, that the detectives had fallen across him inspecting secluded spots likely to be selected by the mysterious assassin for future jobs, that, made up, he had slept, or rather spent, nights in common lodging houses in Spitalfields, that he had been frequently seen in conversation with unfortunates, and that, when no tenant could be found for it, he had offered to take the room in which poor Mary Kelly was butchered in Miller's Court. One of the 2 medical men mentioned, who possesses a good practice in a certain district in the East End, but is somewhat eccentric in his habits, had a very narrow escape from being formally charged before the magistrate on account mainly of the fact that he could not at first give a clear account of himself on the night of the double murder, the night the Berner Street and Mitre Square deeds were done. Just at the last moment, however, his memory, which had temporarily failed him, came to his rescue, and he recollected how he was occupied at the time the 2 tragedies were enacted. The persons described as gentlemen of independent means were West End swells, who in all manner of disguises visited the district during the so-called murder season. One of these worthies was taken into custody simply because he was treating a whole host of women in a public house in close proximity to the scene of the Hanbury Street crime and larking with them, and because he seemed too flush of cash and too polished in manners for the style of his make-up. He was dressed something like a market gardener. At the station, he at first refused to give his name and address, but on finding that unless he tendered a correct account of himself, he would be placed under lock and key, he confessed and was set free. One of the most amusing arrests of all was that of a missionary to sailors. One Sunday evening, during the time that the man with the black bag story was the rage, This herald of the gospel, a short dark man wearing a full-length overcoat and soft felt hat and carrying a bag of the fatal colour, was proceeding home after conducting a service at a riverside mission hall at South Greenwich. He had turned into the main road when he was stopped by a police officer who demanded to know who and what he was. "What do you want to know for, my friend?" inquired the holy man with a look of guileless curiosity. "We have instructions," was the rejoinder, "to stop all suspicious-looking persons carrying bags like yours." "Dear me," observed the gospel messenger, "do I look suspicious then?" At this point a dawn of light seemed to irradiate the brain of the man of piety, for he burst out indignantly, "Good gracious, is it possible? Do you mean to say that you take me for the Whitechapel murderer? Do I look like him?" "That I can't tell," put in the policeman, "but you answer the description of a man who was loitering about in a manor on the night of the last murder, and I'm only doing my duty in stopping you." The missionary hastened to explain, but in spite of his vigorous protests, the good man had to march to the police office, where, however, he soon convinced the inspector on duty that, instead of being a bloodthirsty fiend, he toiled from morning to night to promote the moral and spiritual welfare of the sons of the sea. There is another class of victim in addition to those who have been arrested in the neighbourhood of the murders. The police have received letters from all parts of the country from people certain that some man of their acquaintance must be the murderer. The information contained in some of these epistles was of such a startling character that they could not be ignored, and the persons described were hunted up by the detectives and called upon to prove their innocence. It turned out that in some instances the correspondents had a grudge against the individuals regarding whom they wrote, and thought a capital way of giving vent to their spiteful feelings was by putting the police on the path of the objects of their hatred. Several young ladies thus avenged themselves, or considered they did, on faithless lovers who had disappointed or deceived them. One youthful dame invented a most extraordinary case against a gentleman in a good position in the city, who after courting her for about 18 months was, for very substantial reasons, obliged to renounce her. She declared that he had often warned her, and long before Jack the Ripper, that London would be shocked by a series of awful murders, and that the victims would belong to the class of women who had been so cruelly done to death in Whitechapel. She further asserted that she knew a motive which would have prompted her once upon a time admirer to commit the ferocious deeds. A week or two after the Miller's Court tragedy, information was communicated to the authorities at Scotland Yard, according to which grave suspicion attached to a certain nobleman residing in a West End mansion. The Commissioner of Police at once set his machinery in motion, and for more than a week the representative of the West End aristocracy was watched night and day by detectives who attended him to his club and followed him wherever he went, while independent inquiries were made as to his whereabouts on the dates of the murders. An exhaustive investigation resulted in the Commissioner of Police being fully convinced that he had been put on another false scent. It transpired that the information laid against the man of noble birth emanated originally from a lady of title whom he had grievously offended in some way, and who thought to avenge herself upon him by getting him run in as Jack the Ripper. And with that, the article drew to a conclusion. It got me thinking, though, about those people who had found themselves accused of being Jack the Ripper during those latter months of 1888, and so I delved into the records in search of some examples. It wasn't long before I had found the journalist referred to in the article, who was arrested on no less than 3 occasions, and his case is such an intriguing one that I'll save him for another video. As for those who found themselves accused of being the murderer in the year of the murders, I've selected 2 cases which I feel illustrate not just the type of person who came under suspicion, but also the type of person or persons who were willing to accuse someone of being Jack the Ripper. The first case appeared in the Weekly Dispatch on Sunday the 18th of November, 1888, and the events surrounding it took place not in Whitechapel, but around Berner Street off Oxford Street in the West End of London. Accused of being Jack the Ripper. At Marlborough Street Police Court on Monday, William Avenel, 26, chimney sweep of Adam and Eve Court, Oxford Street, and Frederick W. Moore, 28, carver and gilder of Carlisle Street, Soho, were charged with being disorderly and with assaulting Henry Edward Leake, an oil and colour man of Gilbert Street, Oxford Street, on Saturday night. Leek said that on Saturday evening about 5 o'clock he went into a public house at the corner of the street when several persons accosted him. The prisoners accused him of being Jack the Ripper and told him that they were detectives in plain clothes and that they should arrest him as the Whitechapel murderer. They took him outside and dragged him in a brutal manner as far as Newman Passage. They struck him with a stick and he implored them not to be so brutal. He resisted as best he could and they struggled in the streets together for about 3/4 of an hour. Persons stopped and looked at them, and when the prisoners called out, "He's Jack the Ripper and we are detectives taking him to the station," they made off and did not attempt to render him assistance. He got no protection and was shaken and bruised until he felt quite disabled. When he got near 62 Berner Street, he managed to get away from his assailants and sprung down the stairs of that house into the basement, got into the kitchen, and momentarily lost sight of his pursuers. About 14 young ladies were at tea, and when Avenel followed and told them that Jack the Ripper was in the house and that he, Avenel, was a detective and had come to arrest him, they became terribly frightened and screamed loudly for the police. Avenel, finding him again, dragged him up the stairs, exclaiming, "He's Jack the Ripper!" Madame Muntz, the landlady of 62 Berner Street, deposed that the man Leek had been in the habit of bringing oil, wood, and other articles to the house, and she therefore knew him. Being unacquainted with the prisoner Avenel, she sent for a constable, and he was taken into custody. Leek became so unwell after the affair that he had to take to his bed. In defence, Avenel said that he and his friends were in the public house, where they saw Leek sitting in a corner. He had his head down and was mumbling something to himself. As he seemed strange in his manner, they asked him what was the matter, and he replied, "Don't bother me, I'm in some trouble." They asked him if they should see him home, and when he told them he lived at 62 Berner Street, he, Avenel, doubted it, as he did the chimney sweeping there, and knowing that it was only occupied by females, he expressed his intention of taking him there to ascertain if that statement was correct. On reaching the house, Leek ran down the steps into the basement and shouted to the inmates, "There's a strange man in the house!" He, Avenel, followed, and finding Leek crouching in the cellar, dragged him out. Madame and all the young ladies screamed until one of them, recognizing the prosecutor, exclaimed, "Why, it is our little oil man!" and then they became calmer and less excited. The prisoner Moore said that when he descended the steps, he tried to pacify the ladies, telling them that it was only a foolish joke. Constable Downey, 364D, said that he saw Avenel holding the prosecutor outside the house in Berner Street. He, Avenel, called out, "Here he is! I have got him! This is Jack the Ripper! I mean to take him to the police station. If the police can't do their duty, I can." Being asked who he was, Avenel said that he was a private detective. The prisoner Moore rushed out of the house, but was pursued and taken into custody. Eventually, both the men were conveyed to the police station. The prosecutor was sober, but the prisoner, Avenel, had been drinking. A witness for the defence was called, who stated that when the prosecutor entered the public house, someone exclaimed, "Here's a funny little man, perhaps he's Jack the Ripper." On being questioned, Leek said that his name was Smith and that he was a tin plate worker. That statement being doubted, it was resolved to ascertain who and what he was, and in this way the affair at first commenced. Mr. Hannay said that it was a very dangerous thing for people to personate detectives and directed Inspector Ettridge to see whether the prisoners could be further charged with that offence. Very serious results might have arisen out of the affair, which required further inquiry, and he would therefore adjourn the case for a week, allowing bail in the sum of £10 for each of the prisoners. Avenel and Moore next appeared before Mr. Hannay on Monday the 19th of November, when they both denied that they had claimed to be detectives. Mr. A. Newton, the solicitor who represented them, said that they were both hard-working, respectable men, and told the court that they had a genuine belief that Leek was the Whitechapel murderer. His clients, he said, were more than willing to compensate Leek. Mr. Hannay said that this offer was too late, but he thought it was a case which might have been settled by a civil action. Upon the question of whether the accused alleged they were detectives, he would give them the benefit of the doubt. Leek, however, was a timid man, and judging by his doctor's certificate, the prisoner seemed to have frightened him into a state of nervous depression. The attack was a most groundless one, and the accused must each pay a fine of 50 shillings, together with 50 shillings costs by way of compensation to Mr. Leake, or in default, go to prison for a month. And so the protagonists in this particular story shuffled back into obscurity. On first reading the story, I found it a curious one, but then I really began to feel for poor Edward Leake, who must have been absolutely terrified by what occurred to him that long ago Saturday afternoon, and the case illustrates what could happen when a few ill-informed hotheads felt they had the right to accuse a perfectly innocent man who was simply minding his own business of being Jack the Ripper. The final case in this video takes us to Spitalfields and a street that had become well known in connection to the Whitechapel murders by the time the events associated with it unfolded as the year drew to a close. On New Year's Eve 1888, a girl by the name of Harriet Sinfield appeared before Mr. Montague Williams, the magistrate at Worship Street Police Court, charged with having stolen a purse from William Barrett, a sailor whose ship had put into the London docks. Barrett had met the girl the previous night and had gone with her to a lodging house at 19 George Street in Spitalfields. Interestingly, this was the very same lodging house that Martha Tabram had been staying at the time of her murder. It was also the lodging house where the supposed attack on Annie Farmer had taken place in November 1888, so it was well known to the authorities, as was evidenced by the magistrate's comments about it when Sinfield appeared before him. The following account of Harriet Sinfield's court appearance appeared in the London Evening Standard on Monday, the 31st of December. Harriet Sinfield, 21, who described herself as a maker of fiddle strings, was charged with robbing William Barrett, a seaman, of a black leather purse and £1.15 in money in a common lodging house situated at 19 George Street, Spitalfields. The prosecutor, who belongs to a ship called the Buckhurst of Cardiff, lying in London docks, said that he had met the prisoner on Sunday and had been taken by her to a house where he paid 8p. After some time, she left him on the excuse that she wanted a drink. He examined his coat, which he had put on a chair, and found that a purse containing his money had been stolen from the pocket. He ran after the prisoner without waiting to dress himself and caught her in the street. She screamed and he demanded his money, finally giving her into custody. In reply to the magistrate, Mr. Montague Williams, the constable in the case said that 19 George Street, Spitalfields was registered as a common lodging house for men and women. The magistrate said that he had guessed as much and had asked the question so that the public authorities might know the facts. Over and over again it had been shown that they were used as brothels. The prisoner denied the robbery and neither money nor purse was found. She said that she ran away because the seaman told her he was Jack the Ripper and that he meant to cut her up. That was why she screamed and went down on her knees and begged him not to hurt her. The prosecutor denied all this, but stated that the woman had said something to him about Jack the Stabber, he thought. The prisoner was ordered to be remanded for inquiries, the magistrate doubting her statement as to her age. She really looked not 16. As to what became of Harriet Sinfield, I am afraid I have drawn a blank, as, following the brief coverage of the case over the New Year period, there are no further newspaper mentions of her. It's possible that she was found to be under 16, and the authorities decided to put her into the care of one of the many philanthropic societies in the East End. It's also possible that she absconded from custody and that Harriet Sinfield was just an alias. Whatever became of her, it is interesting that she appears to have been more than willing to accuse a man she had robbed of being Jack the Ripper in order to buy herself some time while she figured out how best to extricate herself from the awkward situation she was in. What all the cases in this video illustrate, however, is just how quickly and how deeply the name and notoriety of Jack the Ripper permeated into the national consciousness after it had been made public in early October 1888. Despite the constant claims made by modern-day armchair detectives that they have finally solved the case once and for all, the truth is that we're no nearer to identifying the Whitechapel murderer today than the Victorian police were. In fact, given that almost all the evidence has now been lost or destroyed, we're probably much further from a solution than they were. But who knows, perhaps one of the people who were brought in for questioning by the police was the perpetrator of the crimes, and he simply talked his way out of being arrested and charged. It's just a thought.